Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. I'm excited to have Jimmy Dore back on the show today to discuss the upcoming 2024 election, or maybe not, and discuss, what's going to be happening and all the conversations around the candidates. And this is one of the most interesting, at least hyped upcoming elections that I've been around for really since I've been doing this. I've never seen this much hype around whether or not it will happen, the different candidates, the interesting differences in the political discussions, and just kind of the changing political landscape that I think we're all becoming aware of because of things like COVID-19 or the Israel-Gaza conversation and how much that's changed things. And as you all know, I'm very skeptical of voting in general, the dynamics in any number of ways around the political structure. And so I wanted to invite Jimmy on to have a conversation about this, because I know that he has a lot of perspectives that will give us some insight into things that I may not be paying as much attention to, and really just to kind of flesh out some of these topics. So Jimmy, always a pleasure to have you on the show. How are you today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
You too, man. Good to see you. So I want to start with the candidates themselves. And as I said before, I'm very skeptical about, even just the basic concept of whether our vote translates, and we can talk about that, to the actual outcome. But, I think it's important nonetheless to understand who these people are and what they're saying they're fighting for, and then whether or not that's even what they mean. And so and by the way, I'll include our past interviews, because you and I have had some really interesting conversations, usually around the political landscape, going back to 2020. Up to the recent one we had, which was, I didn't realize was actually on October 10th. So it was right after October 7th. We kind of talked about that in the context of different things, which was really interesting. So I'd like to start, I'll come back to some of your tweets. I want to start with just the candidates themselves. And so it's interesting as I'm going through the actual candidates, for instance, I wasn't even aware of the different recent changes of people that have dropped out and so on. So as it looks to me, there seems to be about 6 primary candidates at this point. It's Biden and Dean Phillips, who I'm barely even aware of. I didn't even know who he was until I looked into it. And then it looks like Trump, Nikki Haley, and these are just predominant. There's a few other outliers, but then independents, it looks like RFK Jr. and Cornel West. And so I kind of wanted to start with let's just start with Trump, since he's such a prominent character in all of this. Oh, you already have the thought on that? Go ahead if you want to say something.
No, I just think it's funny that you mentioned Cornel West. He's not really running for president.
Exactly. Well, these are things but technically he's still running, even though it seems he's even being accused right now. Am I incorrect in that? I thought he was still technically running.
I think he technically, I guess you could consider.
Exactly, because he's being accused of not really running in a campaign to to really try to win. That was one of the points I was going to bring up.
Well, I figure, I don't know who else is accusing him of not really running, but when he came on my show, it was clear to me he wasn't running for president, because he didn't come on. He's not asking for anyone's vote.
Mm-hmm.
In that he didn't try to win me over. He wasn't asking for the people watching the video, my show that day. He wasn't asking for their vote. And if you're not asking for our vote, then you're not really running for president. It was abundantly clear that he was not interested in trying to garner a broad coalition. It was clear he wasn't trying to meet people where they were at. It was clear that he was simping for Joe Biden and the Democrats. That's what he did.
Mm-hmm.
It was the title of the video was Cornel West as a 45-minute campaign commercial for Joe Biden, because that's what it was. And his refusal to see what's plain to see from everybody else. And the problem with Cornel West now is through his pretend presidential run, is that all his cracks in his personality are becoming perfectly clear. They're becoming highlighted. And his biggest flaw is that his ego is bigger than his IQ.
Wow, that's a scathing criticism, and I think the more I look into it, I agree. But so let's just start with him then, since because we can go over all of them in general. So what do you think his intentions are? And this is a common political tactic. Like, do you think it's as simple as him running just to draw people back over to Biden who might have wanted something different? Is that how you see that, or you tell me what you think in regard to what he was or is trying to accomplish with his run?
I can't get inside. I can only guess.
Mm-hmm.
Other people, my friends over at Russ and Keaton over at Do Dissonance podcast, they say he just likes talking to podcasters, and that's why.
That's funny.
Other people point out that he has a $500,000 IRS tax bill. Boy, I can't imagine that. But and that he was doing this so he could write a book and pay off that debt. That's not an accusation. I mean, so anyway, so there's who knows, but what he's doing is effectively he was simping for Joe Biden and the Democrats, which was what my message was to him, because I was a Cornel West supporter until he came on my show, and he was bent on making an enemy of me, and he did. Or a critic. I'm now a critic of his. Put it that way. I'm not an enemy of his. And yeah. So I tried to impress upon him that as his supporter, that I'm going to be. I would like him to stop repeating Democratic Party campaign talking points, which is that Donald Trump is a fascist and Joe Biden isn't, and that the prosecution of the Democrats' political enemies are just that, political prosecutions. And he wouldn't admit to that, even though when I pointed out to him that the same RICO statute, by the way, the RICO statute was invented in the 70s to go after the mafia, which is why everybody was okay with them, because we're only going to use them to go after the mafia.
Always how it starts.
And so, boy, yeah. And so now they're using it to go after the people who are opposing the expansion of the police state in Atlanta called Stop Cop City, which I know Cornel West supports them. And I pointed out, it's the same RICO statute and the same grand jury that they used to indict Stop Cop City protesters as they used to indict Donald Trump. And I looked at him and I said, now you see the game that's being played, right? And the game is that whoever opposes the establishment in a formidable way, they will criminalize you. And he looked at me and he called me a Trumper.
Wow.
He pretended that he didn't see the connection. And, when a Harvard professor tries to act dumber than a C student YouTuber, there's something amiss. There's something nefarious going on. He's not really running for president. And so when I have to explain to him what's not only happening in America, but it's happening globally. It's happening in Pakistan when Imran Khan, their criminal, because he stood up against the war machine in Pakistan, the most popular Pakistani politician in 40 years. Same thing happening in Brazil. You don't have to like Bolsonaro, just like you don't have to like Trump. But what they did was they put Lula in prison in Brazil because he was too far left for the establishment. And then they thought the center-right guy was going to win in Brazil. And son of a bitch, the far-right guy, which is the Trump of Brazil, Bolsonaro, won. And so they had to figure out, how do we remedy this? And so they had to let Lula back out of prison because he's the only one who could beat Bolsonaro. And he did. And then they immediately criminalized Bolsonaro and bar him from running for president. It's the same thing they're doing in the United States. And it plays with the corporate bought media, what they're doing to Donald Trump, because the corporate bought media is owned by the donor class, and the donor class in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party hates Donald Trump. And, and the question is why? Why do they hate Donald Trump? I mean, they love Donald Trump. My whole life, he was on the cover of every magazine. He was invited on every late night talk show. He was invited on Saturday Night Live. They gave him his own television show on NBC for 10 years. They gave him Emmy nominations. They all golf together. They all go to each other's third and fourth weddings. Their kids are all best friends. So why do they hate him? Well, the Clintons are the ones who encouraged him to run for president.
Right.
So, and they went to his wedding, and so and their kids are best friends. So why do they hate Donald Trump all of a sudden? Well, all of a sudden, Donald Trump starts recklessly telling the truth about Americans' foreign policy. And what did he do? Well, they asked him, why are you leaving troops in Syria? And he said, for the oil. It's our oil, and we're taking it. He just said the other day, we should have taken the oil from Venezuela. He said the country was close to collapse, and if I was the president, we would have got that oil. He just says it right out in the open. And so there's plenty of good reasons for the Democrats to criticize Donald Trump, that being one of them, that his foreign policy is based on oil capture. But of course, they don't criticize him for that because they share that foreign policy.
Right.
And so they have to make up these ridiculous charges now, saying that he did normal real estate business practices are somehow criminal, which is now putting a chill into the business culture in New York City, because now everybody to the point where the governor of New York has to come out and say, hey, no, we're just doing this for Donald Trump because he has bad behavior. But nobody else has to worry about this. Yeah, you don't have to worry about this as long as the establishment likes you.
Right.
And if the establishment doesn't like you, they're going to do to you what they just did to Donald Trump. And everyone sees that now, which is a big problem for New York City. So getting back to Cornel West, and it was a heartbreak for me to see him do that on my show. He won't stop using the divisive language that comes, the DEI language that comes that again, I have to try to remind him, it doesn't come from the bottom up. It comes from the top down. This comes from Vanguard. This comes from BlackRock. This comes from these these places like that. And why? Why do they invest so much in DEI? And it's because they're raping the planet, so they have to wrap themselves in what it seems like virtue, and that's what, and they can do it. So now, I mean, it used to be a joke. We used to show a bomber, and it would be called the Republican, and on the side and below it would be a gay pride flag on a bomber. It would say the Democrats' foreign policy. And well, now they're actually doing that. They're bragging about that they have gay Black women in the CIA. They're bragging that they have gay Black women raping the planet now at BlackRock instead of just straight white men. That's supposed to be a victory for minorities. It isn't, right? So victory for minorities is not to have more minorities in corporate boards. A victory for minorities is to get a raise in the minimum wage, to get health care, to empty the prisons, and to have infrastructure and high-paying jobs.
Or stop murdering them all over the world in the name of democracy, right?
Or stop dropping bombs. That's exactly right. Or stop sanctioning their countries and overthrow and cooing their government so American corporations can steal their natural resources.
Right.
So that's what I tried to impress upon. But Cornel West is stuck in 30 years ago. It's like he hasn't read a book or learned a thing since 1995, so consequently, he's an obscure figure now in American politics. No one quotes him. No one even listens to him, and no one even cares what he has to say. And he's turned on every person who was his former supporter because, like I said before, his ego is bigger than his IQ, and he now has turned on Revolutionary Blackout Network. He's turned what used to be called the Fred Hampton Network. That he's also turned on me. He's also turned on Jill Stein. He also turned on his former campaign manager, Peter Dowd. There isn't anybody who. So if you criticize Dr. Cornel West from the left, he loves being criticized from the right because it makes him look good, right? So that's why he'll constantly go on CNN and take all the insults that they have to throw at him. Cornel West could say he sounds crazy. Anderson Cooper could tell him that he sounds crazy and he's nuts, and he'll call him his brother and come back on his show because he's being attacked from the right. But as soon as you get critiqued from the left, his thin-skinned shows, his egomania shows, the cracks in his personality show. He's incurious. He's unwilling to learn or listen or grow. And that's why he's an obscure figure in politics now. And he's turned into almost a nonstop bullshitter. Almost everything he says now, it sounds like he's just a fast talking bullshitter.
It seems clear based on, just what you're discussing there, that it's the smallest amount of pushback. It becomes clear that you're falling back to the same old two-party paradigm kind of dynamics with those responses. Oh, you're a Trumper just because you said. I mean, nobody intelligent can make that assumptive argument in that kind of situation unless you're trying to use it as a tactic. That's my opinion. So I agree with you. But the point you made in regard to quickly to the Brazil point, I just think it's so fascinating to look at the way that these people, whoever, whether we're talking foreign policy, just the social engineers of our world, that nothing is sacred, right? That's a great point about Lula in regard to, oh, well, he's not what we want. Put him in prison. Oh, now we need him again. Pull him out. Or how Guaido can be the sovereign president of Venezuela until suddenly we don't like him anymore because we need Maduro for oil. So we'll push him to the side. And it's so embarrassing. And my point to saying that, it's exactly what you're seeing with the political sphere too. They will lean into whoever is valuable to their ultimate agenda, which I don't think has anything to do with what's in the interest of Americans.
Which is Nikki Haley right now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my opinion would be all of them, quite frankly. But let's stay quickly on the independent side of it, because so we're talking Cornel West right there. I agree with everything you laid out right there. So the other independent in this, which is interesting because both of them, as always, will be framed as taking votes from one side or the other. That's kind of how they perceive the political game here, is RFK Jr. But I kind of see him taking from both sides in an interesting way, because well, I'll let you speak to it. So where do you see RFK Jr. playing in all this? Because a lot has changed since it first started, especially with the Israel conversation.
I see RFK Jr. taking from both sides, exactly what you said. But the Democrats' calculation is that he will take more from Trump. So that's their calculation. And that's the only calculation. I mean, that's why they basically kicked him out of their primary, which is what they did. And, I told RFK the first time he was on my show, which nobody apparently saw that interview. They only saw the second interview I did with him. So all the things I really wanted to ask him, I asked him in our first interview, and I told him that it was a fool's errand for him to run as a Democrat, and that he wasn't a serious candidate as long as he was running inside the Democratic Party, because they'll never let him get the nomination, and that's a fact. And they've admitted so. They admitted so in court. So
real quickly, were you arguing he should run as Republican, or were you arguing independent at that time?
Independent.
Good. Exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking too. I think he would have had an overwhelming, I think it would have been clear he was the front runner if he would have done that, because that taps into the kind of sleeping giant of people that never partake in the election, which is the largest voting bloc.
Correct. That's what people don't realize.
Right.
That's the largest voting bloc is the people who don't vote. The second largest voting bloc is independents.
Right.
The third and fourth, very close together, are Republicans and Democrats.
Democracy.
So democracy. So the Democrats and the Republicans split 50% of the voting electorate, people who actually vote. The other 50% call themselves independents, and they don't have anybody else left to vote for. So RFK, I was very excited about his candidacy, because it was obvious he has the guts to speak his mind. There was nothing in it for him to tell the truth about vaccines and COVID, and he did it anyway, which is exactly what, Cornel West would not do, right? He would not tell the truth about COVID, which is another thing I brought up on my show. And I said, the time to come to stand up for workers and, put your money where your mouth is, it was during COVID, and you didn't.
Right.
41% of Black-owned businesses wiped out because of the lockdowns. And
That's
I said,
crazy number.
41%. And
crazy.
I said, you said nothing. 70,000 healthcare workers in one state alone were fired because they wouldn't take an experimental medical treatment without long-term studies. And you said nothing. I said, do they all have to be trans for you to give a shit about them?
That's crazy.
And I meant that when I said
I agree. I just think it's such a perfect overlap. Go ahead, please continue.
But there's a price to pay for standing up during COVID and telling the truth. There's a big price to pay to stand up for workers during COVID, and students and everyone else. And Cornel West and all the rest of the people, except RFK Jr., it was clear they were not going to pay that price. They were not willing to pay it. RFK Jr. was. And so I was one of the few people who took all the slings and arrows, just like I took it when I told the truth about Bernie, when I told the truth about Syria, when I told the truth about Ukraine and COVID and Russiagate. And then I was always vindicated on all those things. And Seth Rich, now the FBI doesn't want to release his laptops for 66 years. So, and of course, the Washington Post will never, Dave Weigel, who's a scumbag, and a hand appointed from a billionaire, Jeff Bezos, to cover progressive politics at the Washington Post. Dave Weigel used to do pro-war rallies when he was in college, pro-Iraq war rally. Of course, that's the guy Jeff Bezos taps to cover progressive politics. And then he writes a smear piece on me in the Washington Post about Seth Rich and calling me a conspiracy theorist. But he'll never write an article saying, hey, turns out Jimmy Dore was right about that, Seth Rich, and the FBI is complicit, and they're covering something up. So anyway, so there was a price to pay for people to stand up and tell the truth about COVID. You know who did? Dr. Richard Wolff. he paid the price. He stood up and he was against mandates, and his rationale was inconsistent with his political philosophy. He said, "Why would you want to give more power to the capitalist over your life? Now you're giving the power to the capitalist who employs you. You're never supposed to give more power to your employee, and now they can control what you put in and out of your body and your medical treatments to your employer." He said that's not it's crazy, and he was right. So who didn't stand up for it? Everybody else, including Cornel West. So that's why RFK Jr. was an attractive candidate to me. And then, of course, he goes and blows it all. And he was also telling the truth about Ukraine.
Right.
And then he blows it all with his Middle East policy, put it that way,
Yeah.
and his knee-jerk, unthinking reflex defense of whatever Israel's doing, as if he had been brainwashed, because that's what it seems like. Everything else he says in his life is based on studies, evidence, facts.
Exactly.
And when it comes to, and I was told by someone very close to him that his policy on Israel is not based on politics, it's based on emotion. And so
why do you think that is? Because again, that's a great point to make right there. It's a diametric opposite. Everything else he does is based off information, provable studies, and yet this is different. I mean, we're all susceptible to our emotions and our upbringing and what we think about the world. But do you think that's why it is? I mean, it's just your opinion. But I mean, as I said when he first came out, just like you're saying now, I'm skeptical of all politics. I question every politician, as I believe you do too. But so I was hopeful at the very least. Okay, he's doing a lot of things right. He's calling these things out. When he came out in regard to Israel and said unconditional support, I just said simply morally indefensible. And I would say that about anybody, and I do, about all of them saying that. So it didn't make sense to me. So do you have any thoughts on why that direction that he took at the most important time for his presidential run?
I do, but I think it would be inappropriate, but to say, but all I can say is it resembles some sort of brainwashing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what happened or what. I know the Mossad tapped into my phone and my computer after I gave a speech at the UN.
Really?
They're very powerful. Yes.
Would you want to elaborate on that? Because that's interesting.
Sure. I was on a plane coming back from, I forget where, maybe I was coming back from Europe. And I looked at my phone and it said, MacBook now has control of your iCloud account. And I was like, what? And so when I got off the plane, I called my IT specialist, who's a former military intelligence guy and now works for nation states to try to hack into their computer systems to find their vulnerabilities. That's his specialty. And when I got off the phone, I told him what had happened. He said, "Oh my God, Jimmy, even I couldn't do that." And I said, "Really?" And I said, "Maybe I shouldn't have given that speech at the UN Security Council." And he laughed. And I said, "No, I really just gave a speech at the UN Security Council." He said, "Oh my God, that's what this is." He said that this is definitely a nation state. And then he found out that because he said it's too expensive to do what they did, and that you remember, I don't know if you remember, but there was the San Bernardino shooting a couple of years ago in California, and the guy who did it, that he had an iPhone, and the FBI wanted Apple to let him in, and Apple wouldn't.
Right.
And
that was a big story for a while. It went back and forth, right? Where they were debating on, yeah. Might be familiar with that.
Guess who got him in? The Mossad. So they have a program, and I think it's called Pegasus, that can do that. That can crack those. You can get around the two-step authentication, and so that's what my IT guy told me. That's what they used, was Pegasus.
Wow.
So it was either the Mossad or was another nation state, who knows, working, but they all work together, right? The Western intelligence, the people for the Ukraine war, the same people who are funding and enabling the Gaza massacre and genocide.
Whitney Webb, writer for TLAV, it makes that clear in her books and other work, right? It's the trinational, national security state where there's overlaps and how it's being applied. It's like the technocratic direction.
Right. Correct. So, it's a real heartbreak, and I really wanted to, because I think RFK Jr. has, a lot of courage, obviously, He has let his reputation be dragged through the mud now for over a decade to tell the truth about vaccines, and it turns out he's telling the truth about vaccines.
Right.
It turns out he is. It turns out that they do use aluminum as an adjuvant, if I'm using that word correctly. It does turn out that they don't have the studies that you think that they have to show the safety.
Right.
He does have proof that they knew that the vaccines were causing a lot of trouble, and so they held a meeting, and they didn't do it in a government building. Who did it? Like the heads of the FDA, the CDC, people from Big Pharma, all those people got together, and they did it at a Baptist church somewhere, and I forget the name of it, but he told me it. And he said the reason why they did it there was because then you couldn't do a freedom of information request to get what they were saying. But he got a recording of it, so he knows that they know. And so anyway, so that's why, I mean, he's very attractive to a lot of people, RFK Jr., and you can understand why. He's against the corporate takeover of our government, which everybody else is for it.
Mm-hmm.
And just that alone is attractive, right?
Yeah.
And he's got a history of fighting corporations and being a truth teller. And so that's why his so unfortunate that his Middle East policy would lead to World War III. So I told him when he was on my show that, this wrecks your idea that you're the peace candidate. I go, how does that does that bother you that you no longer can be considered a peace candidate? And of course he did I don't know, I can't remember what he said. But I said that to him, and
I imagine his response was not like, so you feel like it was not a real response? Like, what was your feeling of the response, even though you can't remember it exactly?
He was just more defending his Middle East policy. So it was just disappointing. It was just, and so, they say great men have great flaws, but this one is fatal. And I don't think he can become a president with this flaw and so my idea was, hey, you can still, my idea now is like, it bothered me so much. And so I finally came up, I was talking with my friend Rob Schneider, the comedian, and he's a big RFK Jr. supporter for the reasons I just laid out. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, Jimmy, what do you want him to do about Israel, Gaza? And then it just hit me. And I said, well, how about he comes up with a peace plan? That's all you have to do. Nobody else has one. Joe Biden's plan is to let Israel do what they want. Donald Trump's plan is to keep bombing and killing what he calls terrorists. Mm-hmm. So why not just come up with a peace plan? And then he would be the only one with one. Mm-hmm. And then let's enforce that peace plan.
It would definitely win a lot of support. The only problem I would argue is that, even Biden and Blinken are calling for a two-state solution, but Israel has adamantly expressed right up until today that will not happen. There's no situation where that will be allowed. And we don't have to get into that today, since that will pull us into a whole big conversation. But that's the hard part about it. But I would agree. That if he came out with a logical plan that was rested in, going back to the 1967 state line, the resolution conversation, I would support that. Right. I mean, I think you're right, whether it's disingenuous or not.
You know what I say is, why don't those people in Gaza go back to Palestine?
The people, oh yeah, right, exactly. Well, they're there already, so it works out, right?
Oh, son of a bitch, they are in Palestine, huh? But everybody wants them to go somewhere else. The Zionists want them to go. Why don't they go to Egypt? Why don't they go to Jordan? Why? First of all, they are going in those other places,
right? Or refugee camps there, yeah.
Yeah. Second of all, why? That's like saying, hey, why don't the Americans go to Canada because China wants to take over?
Exactly. I said the same thing about Mexico the other day, that you just argue, we're just going to take this, but you guys all have to go somewhere else. And the point is that there's a lot of countries like Egypt, whether or not they truly care about the Palestinians, and I think there's a mixed bag there, that supporting the displacement is simply supporting the illegal actions of Israel, and we can actually talk about this for the rest. I just know we only have an hour today, and I wanted to get to the other political stuff, but I'd love to pick your brain about the Israel topic. But it's such a large topic, there's so much influences.
You know what? There's better people to talk to about it. But I've covered what Israel as an occupier has done. I covered that.
Which, by the way, Jimmy, is more than the vast majority of people. It's an occupation, right? That right there alone is more than most people are doing. So,
Yeah, and as an occupier, you have a greater moral responsibility than the people who are being occupied,
right.
right? So if you are the warden of a prison and there's a prison riot, you can't just slaughter all the prisoners. That's not how you can't say, well, oh, they're violent. Yeah, so you as the occupier, you're the guys who runs the prison. Now you have to come in and enforce peace.
Right.
You don't come in and enforce a murder and slaughter. So that's the same situation. So I've always covered that. I've showed that how the Israelis don't follow UN charters. Now they bomb UN schools. I mean, safe havens and sanctuaries. I've covered all that. I showed it to RFK Jr. too, and I told him I've covered that because he was making the argument that Israel doesn't try to bomb citizens or civilians, and I was just like, that's it. I've covered it, so you can't bullshit me about that. I've covered it. And so, but when October 7th, but I didn't really know the history of Israel, Gaza, or Palestine. I didn't know the history. I didn't know what the Nakba was. I'd never heard of it. I didn't know much about it until October 7th. And then I was on PBD's podcast like October 8th. Or 9th, something like that. And they were talking about it. And I was just like, God damn it, I don't know anything. And so what happened was October 7th, and it wasn't October 7th, but it was Israel's response to October 7th that made everybody get educated on what I didn't really understand what Zionism was and what it meant. I didn't understand how Israel got formed. I didn't understand what the Nakba was. I didn't understand what the that Hamas was funded by Israel and how Hamas got started and how Hamas was created. I didn't understand why Israel was against the PLO, but they funded literally the Hamas. I didn't understand the blockade, right? I didn't understand any of that stuff. But now I do. And now a lot of people do. And now I understand that Zionism is very close to Nazism.
Right. Well, good on you for stating that and the research around it. I mean, because that's the problem right there, is that this has been publicly available and provable for so long. And I'm so happy to see that this is happening, because this is the point I keep making, is that Israel's response is the reason that people are actually waking up to all of this. And that had they gone directly to the UN and petitioned them for a larger, legitimate military and international response, I mean, the support would have been unparalleled, and so their belligerent action has caused people to wake up to this situation, which, thank God, the Palestinians have been fighting for 75 years. Just pay attention to what we're dealing with, So that makes me very happy to see that this is actually seeding through. And what's interesting is we have, it seems like the majority of peoples of nations speaking out against this, and it's just the politicians pushing back over the UN, over human rights groups, it's pretty. I've never seen it like this before.
This was a misstep by Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israelis. Maybe not by Benjamin Netanyahu personally, because he was already super unpopular in Israel. And so he did, what all unpopular leaders do. They let a war happen, which is, he definitely let that attack happen on October 7th because he knew he could use it as a pretext to go in and do exactly what they're doing now, and that the people of Israel would support him, which they do, to do this, right? And, I found out that there were thousands of people who showed up at Benjamin Netanyahu's house a month or so ago.
Just happened again, too, just recently.
To protest, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, good. Look, there are good Israelis, right? And then I found out that they weren't protesting him carpet bombing Gaza and committing a genocide. They were protesting him rigging the Supreme Court in Israel, which to me is like showing up at Pol Pot's house to protest for more bike lanes.
Right. Well, I will say, though, I agree with you, because that was the earlier one, but there's been multiple examples of them doing it since. And I would argue that, it's a mixed bag, because a lot of them are protesting for a ceasefire, and they're livid that he's not doing that, because they're now very aware that the bombings they're doing are every moment could kill their families that are still there. And they know that. So there's a part of them that are wanting this to stop only insofar as they can remove their families, and then they would be happy to see it all go away. But there is I've been trying to highlight that there's a large portion of Israeli Jews, or just IDF members in general, that are actively against what's happening to Gaza. So I just think that's important to note. But you're right, the overwhelming population, because of the Zionist influence on their mindset, is pro I would argue even genocide, to be quite honest. But I think it's important to note that there's a lot that push back on that,
I like how people say it's not genocide, it's an ethnic cleansing. Like, first of all, that's like the difference between torture and enhanced interrogation.
Yeah.
They
Exactly.
make it sound nice. Oh, ethnic cleansing, they're cleaning them. What are they, giving them a shower? No, they're bombing them. Oh, that's different. So yeah, so when people tell me, "Oh, Jimmy, you're wrong about," I like you, Jimmy, but you're wrong about Israel, Gaza, and I say, well, you have to ask yourself 3 questions. Why does every human rights organization in the world call Israel an apartheid state?
Right.
Why does Israel reject a one-state solution? And what is the Nakba? And so if you can answer those, it takes courage to ask those questions, and then it takes even more courage to answer them honestly. And if you can answer those honestly, you will come to a different conclusion than to support Zionism and Israel. And the reason why they'll never want a one-state solution is because it would no longer be an ethnic Jewish state. It would no longer be an ethno state, which we're supposed to be against.
Right.
Because so that's why it's an apartheid state, because they can't give the Palestinians equal rights, because if they did, then they would there would be more of them than Jews, and so then they would have parity and it wouldn't be an ethno state anymore. And so that's why they're against the one-state solution, and now they're against a two-state solution because they don't want a solution. They want to ethnically cleanse Gaza. There's $500 billion in gas and oil underneath that, and they're doing the same thing in the West Bank, right? And so they want that territory. That's it. And they use this to. So that's what I came to understand because of this. So I think it's been a big backfire for Israel.
I agree.
And before Israel did this, I could have turned the other way at a candidate because of their position on Palestine, Israel. It wasn't on my top 5 things of lists of concerns, right? But and so I could have supported someone like RFK Jr. easily. But now, since what Israel's doing since October 7th, it has gone to my top 5 list of concerns. And I can't bring myself to give support to someone. I can work with someone who's a Zionist on other things, but I have to oppose their Zionism 100%. Zionism, people say, well, Israel has a right to defend itself. Did you know that the law defines self-defense differently than the bloody slaughter of the children of your enemies? Did you know that the law defines it differently than that? So, so I'm against that. I'm against Zionism, and this idea that Israel has a right to exist. From where? I don't get who. Nobody has a right to exist. Does the United States have a right to slaughter the Indians, the American natives, so we can have a right to? I mean, nobody has a right to exist. Okay, that's what I think anyway.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, you're right, and the point would simply be that there's a legal understanding of the history that anybody honest can outline. But I would simply argue that today, because of just like with any situation, there's been Jewish families and just Israeli families that have been born and generationally grew up in the area that want nothing to do with this, don't really care that much, right? The point being that we have to find a solution that factors those things in, and that's why the two-state solution was argued. And if honestly engaged with, that would have been an ultimate solution. But Israel has been proven to have repeatedly made sure, as you pointed out, in one way, arming Hamas for the stated purpose of making sure what they were publicly saying they wanted never actually happened, but also ceding the agreements like the Oslo Accords with poison pills to the point where they knew they would dismiss it. So it's like it's a manufactured setup. I'm just so happy to see that people are finally asking these questions and seeing through it. One last thing I'll include, and I want to get back to a couple candidate questions, is to your point. This is one point that I think Haaretz wrote this. I believe this was 2019. And it's just so interesting that you can have this on the record to where there was the nation state law that was passed, and people debated what it really meant. And there was a TV star in Israel who spoke up and said, listen, guys, Arabs are equal citizens in this country, which is what we hear right now from a lot of the representatives in Israel. And Netanyahu publicly spoke out and said, no, you're wrong. Israel's the nation state of the Jews alone. Like really specifically. And I just think it's so interesting that, just like you said, we're not supposed to be okay with that. If Iran said that today, they would call that racism and an ethno state. The point being is there's an obvious blind spot to that. And so I'm just glad that people are finally asking these questions. So any final comments on that? And then I'll go to some other candidates we can discuss.
So a Jewish think tank did a study about a month ago or so, and maybe even longer. And they analyzed somehow, I don't know how you do this, but they analyzed all the protests happening in the world over Israel, Gaza, and which side the protesters were on. And 95% of all of the protests in the world were supporting the Palestinians.
Wow. That's good to hear. I'd love you to send me that link. I'm sure they call it anti-Semitism, right? Is that the point?
No, the point is that the people of the world have woken up to what's actually happening in Israel.
Yes. That's actually really, really nice to hear. I would just argue, like there was an issue with I think it was the ADL that came out and argued that we saw this massive spike in anti-Semitism, and it turned out all they did was just, write down every Palestinian protest and add that to the list of all anti-Semit. It's the same thing that happened on January 6th. We investigate the grandma with a phone. That became a domestic terrorism investigation. And all of a sudden, domestic terrorism is spiking in the country. It's how they lie to us, right?
They want you to be afraid of your neighbor, and people are. They want you to think your neighbor is the Nazi and the fascist instead of the establishment. And that's exactly what January 6th was about. You're correct. And that was another thing that bummed me out about Cornel West. And I asked him, why do you call Donald Trump a fascist? He likes to say neo-fascist because he thinks it sounds smarter. He's a neo-fascist, which nobody knows what that means except him when he says it. And then he said, and I said, but you don't call Joe Biden a fascist. The black and brown people locked up at much higher rates than their population in the United States is because of Joe Biden, not Donald Trump. Donald Trump actually did the step back which let black and brown people out of prison. And which is why 22% of black voters now support Donald Trump. Why do you call Trump a fascist, but you won't call Joe Biden? And he said, because Donald Trump tried to overthrow the peaceful transfer of power in January 6th, which is just a joke. It's just, just like I know Cornel West knows better than that. And so he just doesn't have the stones to tell the truth because there's a price to pay. There's a big price to pay for him to tell in his liberal circles and to tell the truth about what happened on January 6th, that it was a setup by the FBI to criminalize a political movement so that they can criminalize a political movement so they wouldn't have to deal with it at the ballot box because they can't beat them at the ballot box. That's what this is.
I agree. Really, one more question on RFK, and then I want to ask you about Trump. Do you think he has a legitimate chance of winning?
I think if he got his mind right. I mean, I travel all over this country on a weekly basis, and I was in Milwaukee, and I was in a lot of places, and people who work for RFK Jr., the people who are heads of his organization in their cities, ask me. They go, "Hey, what do you think RFK needs to do to win?" And I said he needs to come up with a peace plan for Israel, Gaza that's not partisan, that's not sided towards Israel, and he has to push it. And they go, "I agree." And they always do it like this. They always do it like this. "I agree," like that.
We all know, yeah.
So everybody knows what the problem is, and he can't be president unless he does that. But if he does that, he could be president.
Just shows you this elitist control over what we're all supposed to think when, clearly the majority is on the side of, not them. But so let's talk about Donald Trump then, because with obviously one of the most prominent aspects of this conversation, the characters and all of this. What do you think of Donald Trump? You have done a lot of work, and I agree, pushing back on the left. And you get criticism in regard to not so much on the right. And I don't necessarily agree with that. So I think it's important to highlight the different dynamic. I call it the teeter-totter of kind of how this goes over so many election seasons. All of a sudden, the who's crazy will flip-flop. But what do you think about Donald Trump, ultimately, his chances to win? What do you think about his policies? Do you think that he's a legitimate candidate?
Well, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump's. I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I won't vote for him. I criticize him when he deserves it, which is not when the Democrats or the media criticizes him, right? They criticize him when they make up things because they agree on all the important things, right? Except war. And so if they just put into this latest a funding bill for Ukraine, they put a bipartisan, which means when some bipartisan's happening, it just means that there's criminals on both sides that have come together. And they made it illegal for Donald Trump to stop the funding of Ukraine war if he becomes president. And so, but let's remember that that's what he was really impeached for. He was impeached because he put a pause on the funding to Ukraine. And so the only reason to really vote for Donald Trump now turns out to be an impeachable offense. And so that's the way they've set it up. They've also put a poison pill in there to tie his hands and say he can't pull us out of NATO. There's no point to NATO. Right. The whole point to NATO was to counter a balance against the Soviet Union. There's no Soviet Union. Right. Russia wanted to join NATO. So at that point, you're supposed to open your arms and greet them and bring them in. Now there's no threat anymore. It's over. But that's not what NATO's about. NATO's about is spreading Western hegemony and about invading smaller countries, stealing their natural resources, and plus it's just about spending money on weapons, right? There's that upward transfer of wealth from the treasuries of Western countries to the weapons manufacturers and the international security state. As Julian Assange pointed out, the Afghan war was not meant to be won; it was meant to be ongoing. Right. Just like the Ukraine war, just like all these wars, the war they have. So when Joe Biden was pulling us out of Afghanistan, you had a lot of simps for the Democratic Party, saying, like for instance, Kyle Kalinske, and people at breaking points like Crystal Ball saying, "Oh, I'm a Biden bro now. Look, he's getting us out of Afghanistan." And I was like, what a juvenile analysis of that situation. Right. I'm a C student, and I know that the real tell of what's actually happening here is what he plans to do with the money that we've been spending in Afghanistan. Did he say we're going to now take that money and spend it at home, or we're going to take it and pay off the debt or give people health care? No, they took that money and they put it towards another war, because that's why the establishment allowed Joe Biden to pull out of Afghanistan, and they allowed him to pull out of Afghanistan in the way he did, meaning that he left all of our military equipment behind. Right. Why did the establishment want him to do that? Because then he has to buy new military equipment from the same people who wanted him to go to war in Afghanistan in the first place.
Right? Let's not forget that. Go ahead.
That's what this game is about. It's a money laundering so our foreign policy is just a money laundering program to give money to weapons manufacturers and in the international security state. That's all this is.
And foreign despots and other dictators, for sure.
And we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Right. And now Germany's paying 2, 3, and 4 times the rate for energy than they were before, and they go along with it because they're simps to the NATO. And we have over 800 military bases, probably closer to 1,000. Right. We just built 2 permanent military bases in Syria. Right. As we call Putin a thug for what he's doing in Ukraine, we've been doing the exact same thing in Syria and worse. Right. In Syria, and apparently that's okay.
Let's not forget that Afghanistan, we're still there. There are still contractors. There are still presence there. We just don't talk about that. And real quick, back to NATO, the interesting part, and Trump in general, is that NATO itself, he's not, and I have the same argument from him about all of this, and I'll bring up your tweet from Ukraine in regard to Trump, is that he's not really saying we're pulling out of NATO. What he's saying is that it's the money situation. And if they pull their part, Donald Trump will happily support NATO. And so I agree with your point. NATO is not something we should be involved in because the interests are not really what we claim they are. But Donald Trump's not really against NATO itself because of that reason. He's against the idea that they're benefiting from it and not paying their due. And the same point here is that, like, as you wrote, I remember Trump saying he would end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. What happened to that guy? Because here he is saying that he would be continually funding. And I think this gets to the real crux of my issue with Trump, is that I don't believe he is the character that he's playing. He is a counterbalance to what the other side is. And I think that's his Paul. I don't believe he is actually fighting for the interest of the American people. And I know that bothers a lot of Trump supporters. I hope they're right. But it's things like this that show you that it's really just, what do they want to hear today? What can I say? Like, I'm a Republican suddenly. Is that what they want? I believe in Christian. I'm a Christian. I don't think those things are even what he actually is based on his books and what he's written about. So to these 2 points about NATO and Ukraine, what do you think about that?
Well, if you take him at face value, what he's really doing is saying that we need to give more money to weapons manufacturers
Right.
because the NATO countries aren't ponying up enough money, because there's a clause that you have to spend, I think it's something like 2% of your budget on weapons if you're in NATO or something. There's a number. I think that's the number, and they haven't been doing it. And so Trump's going to go in there as the enforcer and make sure they pay their protection money. And who do they pay it to? They pay it to not the United States Treasury United. They pay it to the military-industrial complex bank accounts. That's what. And so really, he's in there as the enforcer for the mafia, which is the military-industrial complex in Wall Street.
Right.
And so that's what that is. So he's really, but. At the same time, he's a bit of a contradiction because he's the only president in my lifetime that didn't start a war. And I've tried to figure that one out. And someone told me, I think it was Russell from Due Dissonance, his theory is that if you read Woodward's book on Donald Trump, he talks about how Donald Trump had to make a phone, when a soldier dies, the president has to make a phone call, I guess, or meet with those people. I remember that. I remember Bush had to do that. And he said Trump does not have the stomach for that. And so he'll that's why he ramped up the drone bombing. That's why he'll do bombings, but he doesn't want to do real war because he doesn't want to commit American troops, because he can't handle Americans getting killed. And then he has to tell their parents that they got killed. That's as good a theory as any.
I would argue though that he did. I mean, I could argue in multiple ways that I think he did in fact start new engagements and kept the rest of them going. But I would even argue that he effectively did actually start a new war, which was the war on the American people, the war of the COVID injection, the war of, that, and that's, we forget. I mean, that right there, you could argue was the beginning of World War III, or there's a lot of, narratives around what COVID really was. So it's all opinion, but I would argue that there was, whether you think he meant to, he initiated that,
Isn't it amazing the psyop that the establishment pulled, that there was no bigger pusher of the vaccine than Donald Trump, and somehow they got you to believe that if the people who hated the vaccine, that made you a Trumper. If you question the vaccine, or if you question COVID policies at all, that made you a Trumper, when the guy who was implementing them was Donald Trump. And so, and all the Democrats said that they weren't going to take the vaccine if it came out during Donald Trump's presidency. Kamala Harris said that. Joe Biden said that. So
here, let me play like 2 seconds of it. I got the clip right here.
I think it's going to be a very skeptical American public about taking the vaccine, and they should be.
We can't trust the president and take his word and take a vaccine that might cause harm to us.
If and when the vaccine comes, and it's not likely to go through all the tests that needs to be and the trials that are needed to be done.
Let's just say there's a vaccine that is.
It goes on. You've seen it. I just think that's so hilarious that Biden, and then as you on a dime, suddenly it's all good and it didn't change. It's just there in control,
That's right. It was, and so you see that the establishment, the donor class, hated Donald Trump so much, the donor class, which controls the Republican and the Democratic Party and the media, that, and the FBI, that's what Russiagate was a collusion between the Clinton campaign and the FBI and the CIA. The FBI lied to the FISA court 17 times so they could get phone taps on Donald Trump's organization, which they did. And they got two-hop. Think about this. So when you get a phone tap on somebody, there's a two-hop rule, meaning that you can tap their phone plus anybody they talk to's phone. That's unbelievable, right? So they got that, and they still couldn't find a crime to convict Donald Trump of. That's unbelievable, right? So
do you think that's honest? Or do you think the intention was never actually to charge him? It was more about the show of it all?
No, it was definitely they wanted to. They couldn't find a crime that he committed that they also didn't commit.
Okay, exactly. I was that I agree with, because I think they're all committing crimes.
And so now now they're so nervous now that they threw that out the window. Which this latest conviction of his in New York, he's just doing normal real estate business, capitalist real estate business that every real estate person does in every city on earth, and they've now criminalized that. Right. So they've actually gone even further than they would during Russiagate. What was my point? My point was that my point was that the donor class, which owns everything, they're willing to do anything to get rid of Donald Trump. And I believe that they instigated the Black Lives Matter protests, right? They wanted people to feel like there was your country is on the brink of civil war. They still want you to feel that way. And how do they do that? They foment civil war. And that's what those protests were. And, those were, I firmly believe those were instigated by the FBI, because as soon as Donald Trump got out of prison, the Democrats all funded a new police organization to the tune of $2 billion, and nobody talks about it anymore. Nobody talks about police brutality. There's no Black Lives Matter turned out to be a completely co-opted organization run by criminals who use their money to buy houses and everything else, and they're nowhere to be found. I mean, local Black Lives Matter organizations might be legit, but the national one was a complete joke. So they did that. A lot of people believe that they released that virus on purpose to make it chaos for Donald Trump. And if they'll do Russiagate was a complete psyop. It was completely made up, and people still think it's true. I mean, that's how powerful propaganda is if you say it over and over and over. I mean, the Dunham report proved that it was a CIA, an FBI, and Clinton campaign psyop. The Mueller report, same exact thing. And I revealed it in 2016 that Russiagate was bullshit on my show when I brought on Bill Binney, the number one code breaker for the NSA for decades, and he showed on my show that forensically it wasn't what they were saying, that Russia did not hack into the DNC server. This was done locally, and it was done by Seth Rich, and that's why they killed him.
Right. I mean, what's so frustrating about multiple points you made there is that just to take the election point or any number of them, is that it's obvious, or actually specifically the one about like the Black Lives Matter, the riots and protests and so on, is that on a dime it just kind of changes and nobody acknowledges that. How could that have made sense if and at the end of the day, I don't know whether that means that people really are just that susceptible to suggestion, or that they're misrepresenting what the average people think. I don't know what it was, but I think today, for whatever reason, we're seeing this shift where people are I think it's a combination of the COVID illusion and what we just discussed in regard to Israel. People have been shaken free from this, and to your point, these propagandists right now are relentless with their repeated stated lies on Twitter about basic things like occupation of Gaza. And it's like 14 times a day. And to your point, if you repeat it enough times, you will convince some people. It doesn't matter whether you can prove it or not, So it's really alarming how that works. Now, I know we only have a few minutes left. So 2 last points I want to get into. One is just this last idea about the vaccine with Trump. I do think it's interesting that he has, to this day, never really spoke. He last interview he had, he tripled down on this, saying he still supports this. He still believes it saved lives. He still believes the vaccine is helping. He just I never force it on people, which even that I disagree with. But I wanted your thoughts on why you think that's the case. And I do agree that it is a hard thing for his supporters. It's dividing them to a large degree. Now, why do you think he's still doing that? What's your thoughts on that?
I think he's doing that because he's just a billionaire. How do you become a billionaire? By helping people. He became a billionaire by crushing people and doing the bidding of capitalists. And that's what, that's where he's loyal. His loyalties lie. And he does the bidding of big pharma. He does the bidding of big oil. He does the bidding of Wall Street. And so I just think that's just how the gears work. And he knows where, I don't think he really has a personal belief about Israel. He just knows that that's where his donor money, and he can't go against AIPAC if he wants to have political power.
I agree.
So these are all pragmatic decisions. I don't think that he doesn't have a real ideology, Donald Trump, right? Which is why sometimes he thought he was Republican, sometimes he thought he was a Democrat. It's because he doesn't really have his ideology is to his billionaire ideology, and
he's
so
an
that's
opportunist. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, all politicians are. I mean, that doesn't make him any different than any other politician. So that's exactly it. I mean, it makes sense if you look at it through that lens. And
you're right. It's simple. If you don't look at it through this kind of savior complex, or it's obvious that he's just like everybody else.
He's just lucky that the donor class hates him, and because if they didn't, there'd be no reason to like him.
Yeah, good point. Because that's what drives the illusion or the perception that he is fighting against the system. Definitely.
That the people I hate him. So it's the enemy of my enemy is my friend. He gets a lot of that. And, it's like that Yuval Noah guy from the WEF even said that if Trump gets elected, it's the end of the new world order. And I'm like, boy, I wasn't going to vote for him, but now when you put it that way, so like so Trump's greatest asset is his enemies are so odious.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a great point. I'm very skeptical that in and of itself is meant to sort of drive that support, but it's hard to say. And I think this brings me to let's just I'll put the last three things I was going to get into, and we can discuss, which basically, first of all, voters are seeing cheating everywhere. This is constantly coming out. People are acting like, the sentiment being that both sides basically openly stating that they already recognize the other side is starting to cheat, so they're going to have to cheat to save democracy. So it's like this foregone conclusion that it's already cheating, and like publicly so. And it's really this interesting dynamic. And it even goes back to 2020 where they wrote this article, which I know you're familiar with. They openly stated, yeah, we cheated to save democracy. And you even have this being stated like this. The election could be the end of democracy. Go ahead.
Well, what they admit in that previous article you showed, what they admitted was that there was a conspiracy to stop the president,
right?
The election of Donald Trump, that there was a literal conspiracy of the media, academia, labor unions, political parties, of all tentacles of the establishment came together to stop and thwart the presidency of Donald Trump. And that's really what they admitted. And they did it in secret. And then for some reason, they were so proud of themselves that they did it, that they allowed that woman to write that article in Time magazine explaining it. As to me, that was the craziest thing, that they allowed her to write that article. That I couldn't believe it. I'm like, wow, they're just gonna tell you right now. And everyone knows before the 2020 election, Democrats used to scream, elected Democrats of all stripes used to scream about how vulnerable the voting system was to hackery, and in Georgia alone, they know that they're vulnerable. You could go in and just jump it over with a ballpoint pen. And they said they're not going to fix it until after the 2024 election. So Americans should not have any faith in the integrity of their elections. So I don't, and I think it was a completely legitimate position to always question the validity of the elections up until Donald Trump. And then they'd kick you off. Then they would literally kick you off YouTube if you question the legitimacy of the 2020 election. That's so whenever they come down that hard, there's truth behind it. So when they came down on Seth Rich, you weren't even. I remember when I was on the Young Turks, I was on a panel with Ben Mankiewicz from Turner Classic Movies, and I was on with Cenk Uygur, the host of the Young Turks, and I was being slandered in the Washington Post for asking logical questions about Seth Rich's murder. And they didn't have my back because they're scared, right? There's a price to pay for going against the establishment, which is why the Young Turks doesn't go against the establishment, and why they get $20 million from the establishment and the DNC donors, right? So what I actually was questioning the establishment, and I asked Ben Mankiewicz and Cenk Uygur, and I said, hey, well, can you ever remember we're on the #1 news show in online and in the world. Can you remember, I work for you, can you remember the last time a reporter wasn't allowed to ask a question about an unsolved murder investigation?
Right.
And of course, no, they couldn't because it's never happened before. It's never happened since. So when they push back so hard on the at questioning, that's when there's some fuckery happening. When you couldn't question COVID policy, you couldn't question masks, you couldn't question where the virus came from. You were a white supremacist. You couldn't question natural immunity. You couldn't question herd immunity. You couldn't question transmission. You couldn't question contraction. You couldn't question the efficacy of you couldn't question anything, or else you were a white supremacist, Trump, or conspiracy nut. That's when there's fuckery happening. That's how I knew it in the Seth Rich. That's how I knew it in COVID. That's how I know it. And if you question Ukraine, they called you a Putin puppet. And that's how I know that there's something happening in the 2020 election, because you weren't allowed to ask. You weren't even allowed to talk about it on Google. What's Google, again, invented by the CIA, in bed with the CIA and the security state ever since. And so that's how I know there's something to it. and you don't think they would you don't think that they would rig an election to get rid of Donald Trump? Look at all the things they've done already to get rid of Donald Trump.
I agree.
The same people who lied to you about Building 7 and 9/11, which I just debunked on my show. I've been saying it since I started doing podcasts in 2008 that Building 7 was an inside job done by not the terror. If you're going to tell me that a steel building fell into its own footprint because a plane hit another building hundreds of yards away, I've got a vaccine I'd like to sell you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I would caution though, like my worry is that just because it's being, I think we can prove that there's lots of manipulation, but I do think today we're seeing that there are ways to use that to get us to think that something is genuine, and this is the way we're like, just simply because someone is censored, let's say, does not mean that they're telling the truth, and it can though. And I do agree. That's usually a good indication, but I'm very skeptical.
When everyone is censored, you know what I mean? It wasn't,
but still, go ahead.
It wasn't just one person was being censored about questioning the 2020 election. Everybody was censored. It wasn't just me that was slandered for asking questions about and discredited for asking questions about an unsolved murder investigation called Seth Rich. Everybody was, right?
I agree.
I
agree.
So again, yeah, you're right. If it's just one person, that doesn't mean they're a truth teller. But if they're doing it to everyone, that means there's fuckery afoot.
But still, I generally agree with you. But I would just argue that the people we're discussing, the social engineers and whatever we're discussing, are very aware of our opinion of that. So it's not hard to recognize that they might use that to manipulate us in an event going forward. So all I'm pointing out, and this will be the final question, we can end on this, is that I worry about someone like a Donald Trump, that I do remember things like, for instance, WikiLeaks discussed the fact that there was the email that came out between the Clintons, as you noted, they wanted him to run, but said later that they made sure he ended up on that final stage. And so, yeah, you could argue it's because they believe that would help them win. That certainly makes sense, but I'm also skeptical that there was more to it, And so my final question would be, in general, and it's a big question, so maybe we can talk again in the future, but it's about specifically the idea of voting in general. Do you believe that your vote truly translates to the outcome? Now, I mean, most people do. I don't.
I know when I voted in California in the primary in 2016, it didn't matter.
Okay. Well, and I would argue too that like an asterisk, that I believe that voting at the lower levels, state, county, I would argue that's the best way to go if you think it does, and that's probably where it will. But let's just take the presidential election. I do not believe, and I quite frankly think it's been proven, that our vote does not actually translate to the outcome. That's not to say it doesn't have some level of influence, but I believe that's been proven today.
Well, I mean, yeah. You probably know more about that than me.
Well, I think the reason I ask is because, and this is just more of a thought experiment, because I know that we all have our different opinions. And look, my brother would push back and simply say that, look, if I think it has the smallest ability to influence the outcome, I'm going to do it. And I support that. I don't think anybody should not do it because of my argument, but I would argue that we shouldn't think that's the only thing to do. And I argue simply that if we do know that, or if we consider that it doesn't actually translate, then all of these conversations change, right? Because it wouldn't be that they tried to stop him and he ultimately won. It would be that was what was supposed to happen. And I just think that's something to consider for people,
So I would just like to piggyback off your point about, yes, I vote. But I think that that's not going to really change things. As somebody said, if you could change things by voting, they'd make it illegal, right? So what I would like to see for someone like RFK to do is to try to inspire or organize like a trucker protest, like what happened in Canada and what's happening in Europe with the farmers. And if you could bring the farmers and the truckers and workers together to shut shit down and actually scare the hell out of people in Washington, D.C., and then that's what's needed, right? To actually overthrow I think we need a revolution. Bernie Sanders used to start every speech in 2016 by saying, it sounds like you're ready for a revolution. Well, I don't think the revolution is going to come through voting. I think the revolution is going to come through protest and actually overthrowing the bastards that they're all criminals. If you think that when a session of Congress, If you think they're in there doing the bidding of workers or the elderly or students or the sick or anybody else, you're a chump. They're a session of
I agree.
a session of Congress is there to, how can we rig things in favor of the donor class? And that's all that is. And that's why you still don't have health care. That's why 50% of wage earners earn $30,000 or less. That's why 50% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. That's why most workers, 60 to 80% of workers live paycheck to paycheck. This is why, right? Because we have a completely corrupted government. And people think when you say corruption, they mean, oh, you mean Donald Trump got his kid a deal with the Saudis, or Joe Biden got his kid a deal with the Chinese or the Ukrainians. That's regular corruption. I'm talking about complete corruption, meaning when there's a session of Congress, they're in there completely doing the bidding of the oligarchy, which we do. We don't live in a democracy. That's why that's another big joke. They say you have to vote to save democracy. That's adorable. Your democracy was stolen decades ago. You live in an oligarchy, which was proven by a Princeton study that's over a decade old. If you vote, it doesn't have any effect on policy. So that's the problem with voting. It doesn't really have any effect on policy. So policy only reflects what the top 10% of wealthy people in America want. And that's why we live in an oligarchy and we don't live in a democracy. And that's why it's a joke if you believe the media that's owned by the oligarchy telling you have to vote to save democracy. We live in an oligarchy, and we need to have workers come together and overthrow it. And I really believe that.
Oh, I just one comment, and we can end on this. I agree. I think what's so interesting about that, first, it's protected by the Constitution. Right. You have the right to alter or abolish it should it not be meeting the need. I think if it's not, I forget the exact phrasing, but not achieving the ends that Americans expect, you have the right to alter or abolish it. That is literally what that means. But what's interesting is that this would be framed, because it often in history takes it comes through as violence, right? And so what they would frame that as is calling for violence. But I wouldn't argue that's what you're saying, and I would argue that it always has to mean that. It just simply means that we need change, and it can be a revolution of the mind. It can be an actual revolution. And I think what's important to realize is that that's not some taboo conversation. We need change, and I think that's importantly what we need to be discussing, whether it's wholesale or different things like that. And I frankly agree with you, man. So I praise your courage for saying that. I know people are going to use that against you, and I think that's important to stand by.
Yeah. So I appreciate you saying that. Thank you. And I also applaud your courage. You've had more courage than me in lots of different areas, and I follow your lead on things. And, but it used to worry me a lot, right? When people would attack me and try to discredit me. But I've survived all that. And now the people who watch my show and come to my live shows, they know that when I get an attack, like it's a bad faith attack, they can tell the difference between an honest criticism and a bad faith attack. And just like with Trump, all these bullshit prosecutions, they just make him more of a martyr to his followers, just like the bad faith attacks on me. When people with MSNBC contracts do a video about me, attacking me, that's a win for me. That's not a bad thing for me. Right. So when people who take $20 million from DNC donors do a video about me and attack me for being anti-war, that's a win for me. So it's almost like I'm immune to it now. So it's when Newsweek does an article about me, calling me the leader of the dirtbag left, that's a win for me. I have that framed up in my house. That's a great thing for me. So if I'm the enemy of the establishment and the people who are mouthpieces for them, that helps me. And yes, I've been bad faith attacked about everything I've said, and it hasn't seemed to stop me. And so it kind of doesn't bother me as much as it used to. It still bothers me when people I've known all my life bad faith attack me. Yeah. But that has to, it's just, so I saw a Buddhist monk say that the brighter your light shines, the more shadows you cast.
Interesting. I like that.
So that really gave me a lot of peace and comfort when I heard that, because that's what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, man. Well, that's such a great note to end on. And I'm so glad that you persevered, because, anybody in this field knows very well that people, especially as you're saying, when you're calling out the establishment that people are going to come and try to attack you in the most baseless, ridiculous, and personal ways. I'm just so glad that you stayed the course. I will include, by the way, just this article that I wrote a while back that I think is important for people to consider. We don't talk enough about as I put the true power of abstention and the reality that we've been lied to about what that really means. It doesn't mean not voting or not caring. It's actually a legitimate path to take. Right? The founding fathers conversation, you could abstain from a vote if you thought that the vote was illegitimate, if you thought any number of things. I just think that's important to think about. Like, we technically should have a box that says abstention when you vote. That's no longer there. It's like jury nullification. They just remove these things from your understanding. I think that's important to consider, especially if you agree that there's some manipulation going on here. So
Hey,
I'll end with.
So can I ask you?
Ahead.
You sent me that article about marijuana.
Yeah, the one I just put up on Substack.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
I read. I'm only about I'm about 3/4 way through. I agree with what you put in there. Did you know I quit smoking pot?
I heard through the grapevine, yeah, that you put it down for a minute. That's why I kind of sent it to you. I was curious if you would, because I agree, anything overused, everything in moderation, right? But it's interesting to see how that can benefit people, and it doesn't even have to be smoking. Like, just actually, like, the CBD THC overlap is our endocannabinoid system. It benefits us tremendously. So I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, we have I don't know. I can't say that word. That endocannabinoid system.
Right.
We have that.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was a young man, I used to listen to a guy named Dr. Dean Adele. And Dr. Dean Adele used to talk about the craziness of the drug war, and which is why he was marginalized. But he explained how the chemical THC and the receptor in your brain fits like for all chemicals. So that's obviously, there's a reason why that is biologically and evolutionary wise, why that happens, right? So we can't ignore that. It fits like a lot. When I heard that, I was like, oh, that's really something. And so I don't, even though I've walked away from marijuana, I don't have bad things to say about it. It always served me well, and it helped me in many ways. And so it just was time for me to let it go. And I really don't even know myself why I did it. I don't. I think I'm being directed by as Carl Jung would call my unconscious transpersonal center, which is another word. This is another word for God. But I think that this is happening for some bigger reason, and it also forced me. I used to like to have 2 cocktails with dinner every night, and it forced me to. I can't even do that anymore because I can't sleep since I quit smoking pot. I used to smoke pot to go to sleep. I would smoke a bowl, go to sleep. If I woke up in the middle of the night and smoke another bowl, go right back to sleep. And so it really interrupted my sleep pattern. And so I was only sleeping 2 hours at a time, which is not good. And then when I got it up to 4 hours at a time, which was much better, if I had a cocktail, it would go back down to 2 hours. And so I'm like, son of a bitch, I can't even drink anymore. So I've been almost completely sober since September. I mean, it's not a big lift for me not to smoke pot. Something happened. I don't know what happened. Again, I think it's something. Carl Jung says your unconscious sets up the future long in advance, which is why it can be guessed at by clairvoyance. And so I think there's a purpose to this. I'm curious to find out what it is.
Well, I'm actually that's outstanding, man. Like the need to follow that path. You got to trust your instincts, and something guides you in that direction. Follow it. I think that's fantastic. And I think that everybody can benefit from being sober in like the realest sense from all the things we put in our body for periods of time or indefinitely. I'll leave with a state, or I think it's a quote, or is a quote from I believe Ben Harper, and I think he said, just paraphrasing, that that he believes in cannabis in general. He's written many songs about it, but he said, if you're not where you're at or want to be at in your life, maybe just put it down for a while, and he's a big advocate for it. And I think it just shows you it's about, it's it's all moderation, all things in moderation, and the concept being that, you got to trust your gut and your instincts. And so I'm glad you brought that up, man. I think, but the point overall with the article is, that there is an innate connection to specifically cannabinoids, which come through other things other than smoking cannabis, and it actually is like profound in the concept of like breast milk. And the idea that it actually comes through the breast milk of a woman, whether or not they've ever consumed any cannabis product. And it actually helps the baby suckling process. And, so there's something innate, like internal, that is designed with the human body. And that's so fascinating to me. And so I think it's something we just need to continue to look into. And it's one of the things that we're boxed out from in every aspect of our life today. And I just find that really interesting. So yeah, follow your instincts, man. And I praise you for that. So, anything else you want to leave us with, upcoming shows that you want to shout out, anything you want to talk about in the future?
I'll be coming to, it looks like my shows in Europe are going to sell out. So, I don't need to plug that, but maybe Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, Palm Springs, Cortland, New York, Oakton, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Pittsburgh. Those would be the shows that I'd like to people. If you're in those areas, come see a live Jimmy stand-up show.
Outstanding. Any time coming back to Nashville anytime soon?
Yeah, so I'd like to space it out at least 12 months. So I can't. I think I was there last summer for their festival, which was great. It was fun. I sold out 2 shows there. It was fantastic.
Nice.
At the Zanies. So yeah, I'll be back in Nashville. Hope maybe in the fall.
Okay, outstanding. Here, I'm just trying to grab this to bring it up for you. So I'll include these links so you guys can check out both his Twitter page as well as is this the right one? Yeah, this is the one you listed. So, yeah, and so you guys can find the events and stuff. So thanks for joining again, Jimmy. I always enjoy our conversations, and I think that it helps people reach. One thing I always like about any of my interviews is that we have our own opinions, and that somehow through this conversation we kind of synthesize something new, new thoughts and understandings of things, and I think that's tends to happen with our conversation. So thank you for joining. And go ahead.
What are those 2 things on the side of you? Are those speakers?
Oh no, they're chairs. It's just chair. I do the Pirate Stream podcast here as well, and we usually have more than 2 people alongside us.
Okay. I was just wondering what that was. Okay, that's all. But hey, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure. I'm a big fan of your work, and I respect your opinion on things.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
For the last few years, I've had this sense that everything I learned as a kid about how America's government works is completely wrong. But I had no idea how bad things actually were until I saw this one graph. Researchers at Princeton University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a pretty simple question. Does the government represent the people? Now, this is what they found. This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left, at 0%, are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right, at 100%, are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. On this graph, an ideal republic would look like this. If 50% of the public supports an idea, there's a 50% chance of it becoming law. If 80% of us support something, there's an 80% chance. You get the idea. Now, most Americans would probably agree that, with a few exceptions, we should be as close to this ideal as possible. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. Take an idea that nobody supports, literally nobody, and it has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law. Now, take an incredibly popular idea, the most popular idea this country has ever seen, and there's also about a 30% chance of it becoming law. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. Put another way, and I'm just going to quote the Princeton study directly here, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So if you've ever felt like your opinion doesn't matter and that the government doesn't really care what you think, well, you're right. But there's a catch. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal. When they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. And when they don't, they have the power to completely block it from happening, no matter how much the rest of the country supports it. They get what they want, and guess who ends up paying for it? We pay for it with the most expensive healthcare in the world. We pay for it with a tax code that's a complete mess. We pay for it with internet that's slower and more expensive, with wasteful spending, a floundering education system, a catastrophic drug war, and 1 in 5 American children born into poverty. Almost every major issue we face as a nation can be traced back to this graph.